So, welcome back, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. We are now beginning the last workshop of the conference on animal welfare. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker and co-chair for this session. Unfortunately, Dr. Faye Clark was unable to join us today due to unforeseen logistical issue. However, we still have a fantastic lineup prepared featuring the following speaker. So first we have Heather Browning, who is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Southampton. After working for many years as a zookeeper and zoo animal welfare officer, she's now a researcher in animal sentience. Expert in evaluating the quality of measurement of welfare in a large scope of animal, you would see that her presentation is titled Evaluating Measure of Animal Welfare. Our second speaker will be Denis Bahati, who is a veterinarian based in Kenya. He is part of the Africa Network for Animal Welfare, a non-governmental organization which works with stakeholders to promote animal welfare. And they achieve this by conducting on-field research, influencing policy, community empowerment, advocacy, and attitude change. His presentation will be titled Gaps in Policy and Legislative Framework in Addressing Industrialized Animal Farming in Africa. Co-chairing with me today is Janire Castellano Bueno, Outreach Manager at the Wild Animal Initiative. This is a non-profit organization committed to advancing wild animal welfare as a research field through both direct research and by fostering connection in academia. So our workshop will follow some like a roundtable format. Each speaker will present for 10 to 15 minutes. After that, we will have 30 minutes for open discussion. So please feel free to share a question in the live chat. Janire and I will ensure that they reach out to our speaker. And with that, I'm delighted to give the floor to Dr. Heather Browning for a presentation on evaluating measure on animal welfare.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here today. I'm very excited to speak a bit about some of the work that I've done on thinking about how to evaluate different measures of animal welfare for how suitable they are for use in different contexts. So when we're thinking about, almost any context where we want to know whether animals are doing well or doing poorly, what we need to change in their environments, what kind of protections they might need, how different policies might impact on them, all of these things requires us to measure their welfare. And in lots of these decision contexts, we need accurate measurement of animal welfare. We need to know, exactly how well an animal's doing or exactly how much it will be impacted, either positively or negatively, by any changes that we make. And these might be decisions made at the level of government, at the level of different institutions managing animals. They might be people managing animals in the wild. It might be scientists in laboratories. But all these sorts of different decisions will require us to have accurate measures of animal welfare. And so for that reason, we need to think about what are the measures of animal welfare that we have available and how do we evaluate which ones are going to be better for the different purposes that we want to use them. So there's a very large range of animal welfare measures, and these all have different strengths and weaknesses and can be used in different contexts. So when we're thinking about all the different kinds of measures, for instance, we have animal-based indicators. So these are measures of animal welfare that are taken directly at the level of the animal, and this can be measures of their physiology, their behavior, their cognitive processes, and they tell us something directly about how the animal is being influenced by what's happening to it. And these could include measures like their heart rate, changes in stress hormones like cortisol, presence of stereotypic behaviors, preference tests that show us, how hard animals will work and what kinds of conditions they prefer. All of these are the sorts of measures that tell you something about the animal themselves. And you also have environmental indicators. So these are sort of measures that look at some aspect of the environment that the animal lives in that may cause a change in their welfare. So, how much food is available to them, what's the quality of that food, what kinds of shelters do they have, what kind of social environment do they live in? And these are more indirect in that they don't tell us, specifically how the animal is responding, but they can sort of tell us what sort of risk or opportunity factors are present there in the environment. And so there's still useful ways of making inferences about the welfare of an animal, even if it's less direct than the animal-based indicators themselves. But, with all these different sorts of indicators, and there's a huge, huge number of them, when you're thinking about measuring welfare, it's really important then to choose a measure of welfare that's going to fit whichever context it's being used in, whether that's in your agricultural contexts, in zoos, in the wild, whatever it is. There's going to be sort of different strengths and weaknesses for the different indicators, and they're going to apply more or less well to different contexts. So it's really important to think through that context and what the decision process is going to look like for those contexts. So what I'm going to be talking through today is what I see as the different steps that are needed when you're evaluating a measure of welfare for how good it is for a certain context or a certain purpose. And so the first one of those will be choosing what concept of welfare you're going to be working with. The second is identifying what the context is for the use, then setting out the desiderata for that measure relative to the context. So, different contexts are going to have different criteria for what makes the measure useful or good. And then to go and assess the measure or the different measures that you might have against these criteria so you can choose the ones that are going to best work in the context. So to begin with, the first thing that's needed is to choose a welfare concept. So, if you're trying to evaluate whether a measure is going to be good or bad, you need to decide what concept of welfare you're going to be using. That is, sort of what definition, how are you thinking of what animal welfare is? And we see really commonly that people can fail to be explicit about what welfare concept they're using, and they just sort of take it for granted. And this can lead to people talking past one another. So people are saying, this is good for welfare and this is not good for welfare. And they just mean entirely different things by welfare. And so they've got this sort of fundamental level of disagreement with each other. Whereas if you can be explicit about what concept of welfare you're using, it allows people to get on the same page about what they're trying to do. Because the way we think about welfare affects how we measure it. So obviously, your indicators are going to be different depending on what the target is for what you're measuring, and that will impact what kinds of decisions you make about what's best for welfare as well. So I've got these two pictures here. These are some spider monkeys in two different housing situations. The top one is sort of an unnatural cage with logs and tires and bars, these sorts of things here that are not very natural features of an environment. And the bottom one is a more natural environment that has a lot of greenery and trees. Now, depending on which welfare concept you use, you might think differently about which of these is best. So the top one, according to concepts which think about, the animal's feelings, that might be the best one because it gives the animal a lot of opportunities to play and move around. Whereas the bottom one, perhaps there are fewer of these opportunities, like those trees aren't very climbable, for instance, but it allows the animals to be in a more natural state. So, if you think more about the naturalness in welfare, you're going to like the bottom one. If you think more about the animal's sort of subjective experience, you might prefer the top one. And so this makes, fundamental differences in the decisions we make. So it's important to think about the welfare concepts we use. I'm not going to go into detail, but there are different kinds of concepts. It's a subjective experiencing, physical functioning, natural living, animal preferences. I prefer the subjective experience account. And so some of what I say today may kind of hint at that account, but whichever account you take, it's really important to make sure that your indicators are going to be tracking it. So just here, sort of taking the subjective welfare account to be the quality of the animal's experience, its feelings, sort of, conscious experiences over its lifetime. And this includes the whole range of affects, things like, their sleep, how they feel when they're eating, playfulness, resting, all these different positives and negatives that build together to make their welfare. So once you've identified the concept you want to use, the next is to think about the context that you'll be applying it in. So, these can include scientific contexts, such as using welfare as an explanatory variable if you're doing animal behavior or ecology, thinking about how it impacts the way the animal interacts with its environment or other animals. Management contexts, if you're a zookeeper trying to figure out whether your animals are doing well or what to improve for a certain kind of animal. There will be policy contexts like cost-benefit analyses or impact assessments, and welfare certification programs as well, where they're trying to look at the welfare of products that come out of different kinds of farms and decide whether they're positive or negative, whether they can be recommended to consumers underneath their label. And just thinking some more about some of those public policy contexts, some examples of this, thinking about climate change policy, how do certain climate events positively or negatively impact the welfare of animals, or what are the negative externalities of agriculture? So how could you price in, the welfare costs of agricultural systems when you're making prices of meat or other products like that? So these are the kinds of, sort of policy examples that require welfare measurement alongside all these sort of typical, I guess, industry and scientific kind of situations. So once you've thought about your concept and whatever context it's going to be that you're going to be measuring welfare, you then think about what are the desiderata for your measure of welfare in that context. And I'm going to just really quickly sort of indicate a few of these kinds of desiderata, and these will vary depending on the context, but I can group them under correctness criteria, usefulness criteria, and feasibility criteria. So correctness criteria just talk about, whether the number that measure is producing is in some way accurately, validly representing the experience of that animal. So, firstly, is it a valid measure? Is it actually measuring the thing that you want? That's going to be important in any context. Is it accurate? Is the number close to the real experience of the animal? That is going to depend on context to how accurate you have to be. Usually the more accurate, the better, but that's often trade-offs with costs. Completeness, this is whether or not the measure covers all the different aspects of welfare that the animal experiences. And again, this might depend a bit on what the context is. In some contexts, you might need to only know whether or not the animal is feeling stressed, for instance, and not really need to think about its comfort feelings or behavior. But in other contexts, you might need to know everything about how that animal is feeling, so you can sort of assign it a welfare score overall. And then in reliability, you're thinking about, is this a repeatable measure? Does it show similar results when different people do the tests and when they're done in different conditions? Then the usefulness criteria, these are much more context dependent, because what is useful for one context is not going to be useful for another. So this includes the range of applicability, how many different species does this indicator need to cover? How many different sort of living contexts does it need to cover? Is it only just one kind of farm? Is it many different kinds of farms? Are you looking at all the animals across a zoo? So that range of applicability, what kinds of things you'll be able to use it for, will narrow or widen the scope of which measures are going to be useful. The cardinality, so that's whether you actually get a numerical output, a meaningful numerical output from your measure, or whether it can just give you a ranking that, this welfare state is better or worse than another, versus this one is twice as good as another. Again, in some contexts, those rankings might be fine if you're just trying to choose between two things. You just need to know which one's better. But in other cases, you might need to know exactly how much an animal is being impacted. And then finally, we need appropriate thresholds. This is really important, particularly in a lot of certification contexts, and it's something that's often overlooked. So that's something I thought I'd just go into more detail on very quickly. So when we're thinking about the threshold for welfare, that is the threshold at which, the certification gets its stamp. So it's like, okay, how good does welfare have to be before you kind of get your tick on this certification box? And there are a whole bunch of different levels that could be sitting at. I've got this sort of little graph here that sort of suggests some of these different things. You've got this whole spectrum from positive to negative welfare. And anywhere along there, any one of those lines could be where that tick comes. And so there's no sort of scientific reason for picking one above another. This is going to be a reason based in values. But what's important is that, these thresholds should relate to how the animal experiences its welfare, not to just something like, oh, it needs to have this amount of beds. It's like, well, why do they need to have those many beds? Why does that benefit the animal? How are they experiencing that? And we should also be thinking about multiple stakeholders, not just, how does the industry currently do it? Is it best practice for now? But perhaps, what do welfare scientists, what do other sorts of people who are involved in the use and breeding and management of animals, how do they see where these thresholds are? How do we set them in a principled way? And there's a possibility of setting multiple thresholds as well. So there might be, one that's the minimum standard, and then you have aspirational tiers. Some certification schemes have things like this. But I think, what's really important is just to be very explicit about what the thresholds are and how they were determined, that they weren't just sort of picked randomly based on current practice. And then finally, the feasibility criteria. These are just, how you can operationalize this measure in practice. So it's going to be, what kind of cost does it impose on time, money? How easy is it to use? What ethical implications? So, is it very invasive? Does it disturb the animals a lot when you apply it? And in some cases, is there data already available? If I'm a policymaker who wants to use a certain measure of welfare to make a decision, is there already data available about how these animals will be impacted, or do we have to go out and collect that data, because the latter might be much more difficult if you need to make quick decisions. And then finally, once you've sort of thought through all this, what's your context, or the desiderata for that context, you just assess the different measures that you have against those different desiderata. And this should be a qualitative assessment, not a quantitative one. You're not saying, oh, this one ticks 8 boxes and this other one ticks 10 boxes, because not all the desiderata are going to be equally important. Things like validity are going to be much more important than, say, I think some of the feasibility criteria, for instance, the cost. So it's really difficult to set exact weightings between these things to give you sort of meaningful scores. And that's why you should be thinking about a holistic assessment. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each measure, and reflect on, on balance, which is going to be the best to use. So there's a range of different welfare measures. For reasons of time, I won't sort of go through these here, but you can have whole animal measures that measure the entire animal. We've got partial measures, that these animal and environmental indicators I talked about, and also measurement frameworks that can bring together multiple indicators to get a sort of more complete pictures. These all have different strengths and drawbacks. So the whole animal measures are very comprehensive, but they don't really give you guidance on what in the environment needs to change. The partial measures can give you very specific information, but they don't give you everything information because they are by definition partial. Measurement frameworks bring all these together. So they give you a really comprehensive overview of different aspects of welfare, but they can be potentially incomplete because, when you're listing a whole bunch of different indicators, maybe you miss some. And again, you come into this problem, how do you weight them? How do you weight indicators that relate to food intake against ones that relate to health status, for instance? So that can be quite difficult to do in practice, but obviously allows you to get a lot of information about what's impacting the animal. So, this is sort of a whirlwind tour through the process, but the idea is to just get this conversation started, I guess, about how to evaluate these measures for our purposes. And so thinking about these 4 steps, choosing the right welfare concept, identifying the context you want to use your measures in, laying out the different desiderata you have for that measure, what does it need to do, and then assessing the potential measures that you have against the criteria to identify which ones best meet your needs. And this allows you then at the end to sort of find and apply the best measure or measures for the context. And sort of the one last point I put up there is I think that using different measures together can help people gain the benefits of different measures while offsetting their shortcomings. So if one has less completeness, you put it together with one that has more completeness but less sort of data involved, you end up being able to get perhaps a more holistic picture about the welfare of your animal. All right, thank you. Here's just some links to the papers that this research is based on in case you wanted more details than I provided here, or feel free to get in touch. I've got my contact details there as well. Thank you.
So thank you, Heather, for this interesting presentation, and which serve as kind of an introduction to measurements in animal welfare. So I think Jenny is running into some issues, so for now we are still waiting for him to join. But in the meantime, maybe Janire can talk about the Wild Animal Initiative and its purpose, and maybe it would be interesting for our audience because they have some grants and things like that. So I think it would be interesting for the audience. So Janire, if you want to share some slide with us.
Yeah, sure. Give me a second.
And if you have some question for Heather, please keep them, put them in the chat, and during the question or discussion time, we can ask her. Okay, so Janire, the floor is yours. I will now cut my video.
Okay, can you see the screen, my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Sure, so yeah, I'm happy to say a few words. So as Catherine already shared, Wild Animal Initiative is a nonprofit that is research-based and is dedicated to the growth of wild animal welfare science field. So this refers to the animals, the free-ranging wild animals. So it wouldn't include companion animals or zoo animals, but the animals that are still in the wild. And we have 3 programs. So we have some internal research that focuses mainly on the more foundational research of the field, validation studies and more theoretical studies. But we also fund different projects. So we have grants, different sizes, fellowship programs as well, for different research on the field. And we also have an outreach program that is aiming to connect the different researchers, create that community of wild animal welfare science, and advance the growth of it. So if you are interested, you can join the community. So we share some opportunities for the field, and we also have different resources in terms of like the types of methods that are being used right now. So you can access the link tree that you can see in the QR code here in the screen, and I will show you some opportunities. And if you have any questions, you can also contact me the email. So it's my name at wildanimalinitiative.org. I'll be happy to answer any questions on it.
Thank you for this presentation. So I hope the participants appreciated the short presentation, and now I think we will start the discussion time. So we already have one question in the chat by David. So it's for you, Heather. David says, when setting animal welfare goals for legislation, how do we avoid bias to charismatic animals and away from the less attractive animals, such as insects and pest animals?
Okay, good. Yeah, this is a very important and very difficult question because I think, anyone who knows anything about the current animal welfare legislation in many parts of the world is that, it tends to make weird exclusions for animals that are less charismatic, so in laboratories, in the UK, primates and dogs are protected, but rats and mice are not. And so, you get these sort of strange things that are based that. And so I think, in part, taking this more animal-centered approach, thinking about the sentience of different animals, thinking about what the world is like from their point of view, is a really nice way of making sure that we're not being too biased because, you're setting your legislation, you're thinking, well, we shouldn't harm certain kinds of animals. And then you just think, well, what are the kinds of animals that can be harmed? What are the features of the animal that matter from that point of view? And I think trying to provide explicit justification for why some animals are included or not, perhaps is a nice way of making sure that, these animals aren't overlooked. There's certainly then an entirely separate question, which is, how do we make people care more about it? So, we might be able to put it in legislation. It's not the same thing as sort of gaining general public support. But I think, I guess I was surprised. So I was involved in a project a few years back in the UK for assessing the sentience of cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans for the change in legislation that we had here. And I was really surprised by the level of public support that there was for the decapod crustaceans. Like, I know lots of people like octopuses, they're very popular, they've got their Netflix show, My Octopus Teacher. But yeah, the decapod crustaceans, I wouldn't have thought crabs and lobsters were things that people really, had much love for. But yeah, there really was quite a lot of public support in view of their sentience and that they needed these kinds of protections. So perhaps it really is just, letting people know something about the animals helps them develop this kind of care.
For sure. I'm working on bees, and I know people are not super fond of insects, but for sure bees are their favorite. So whenever I
so there might
present
be like
something,
a gateway.
they are really interested in this kind of result. And actually, this morning we had a workshop with Andrew Crump about invertebrate sentience, and he was talking about this decapod crustacean UK legislation that you did together. So I had a question related to that. do you see, because it was saying that there is not a lot of animal welfare on invertebrates. And now, do you see a shift in the animal welfare research toward incorporating more invertebrate focused studies?
Yeah, there's certainly a shift in that it used to basically be nothing, and now there is some small amount of it. So that's definitely a shift. There is interest, there's organizations like the Insect Welfare Research Society now and things like that that are certainly trying to get these sorts of things on the table. I think the major bottleneck for this is still funding. Any researcher knows that it's difficult to get funding for your projects. And I think it's especially difficult if you're doing something that's a little bit new and different, that's sort of not part of the established mainstream of research, trying to sell to funders why this is something they should care about. And particularly, why should you care about the feelings of insects or whatever? I think it's still a little bit of a hard sell. So that's where I see the bottleneck. I know there are a lot of interested researchers who would like to pursue these avenues more. So I think there is certainly the interest there at the researcher side. It's just whether or not they're able to pursue that work.
Yeah, it's always the question on how to get funding for this kind of research, right? So I have more questions. I think Janire also had some. Maybe while she's looking for that, I can ask another one. So you were talking about like these measures that are often made individually. Is there also some measure that can be made at the group level? I know, like for example, working on bees, a lot of beekeepers always look at colony, the welfare of the colony. So I'm wondering if it's the same thing sometimes in other animal care.
Certainly, it is done that way. So certainly, people who keep large groups of animals will do measures at the group level. So, herds of cows or sheds of chickens or something like that. The worry about doing those kinds of things is that, if we think on most definitions of welfare, it really is a property of the individual organism. So, even with bees, they're presumably sentient animals. There seems like quite a lot of evidence in their favor now. Definitely so for cows, maybe fishes. All of these animals are themselves individually sentient. And when you look at group level measures of welfare, potentially there, you're missing the experience of all those individuals who are missing out. So if you say, well, look, the group's doing all right, we only have 20% of a certain disease, well, that's, still 20% of your animals, some quite a large number of individuals who are all suffering that effect. And, given that the health of one animal doesn't make another animal feel any better, the worry of including group level measures is that you are going to overlook that. Of course, the practical constraint on that is that when you're keeping large groups of animals, sometimes it's really just not feasible to sample every single one of those individual animals. And so certainly, having group level measures is better than not having them, not measuring anything at all. But I guess, being critical when they are being used and thinking about what they're representing, and perhaps trying to, I guess, join them with other more individual measures so that you're getting a sense of both things.
So you would say basically that individual measure have more weight than group measure, but in some cases it's like it's time consuming and you cannot do everything. So it would be best to do a bit of both.
Yeah, that's right. There's always going to be a trade-off between sort of feasibility and accuracy, I guess. And so, it's going to just depend on the specific context, how much you can really get the accuracy that you need. But I guess keeping in mind that using group level measures will be some compromise on accuracy, at least makes that trade-off explicit.
Thank you, Heather. So I do have one question to ask. So you mentioned the importance of having really clear definitions on what you define as welfare, and what kind of frameworks you are using. What do you think is the best approach as to either collaborate without having to deal with those differences? So in terms of creating new terms for the different definitions, or some kind of collaborative framework where you can share all the data and all the information you have, or what do you think is the best approach for that?
Yeah, so I mean, depending on the context, there's probably two main ways of approaching it. So first one would be to look for areas of overlap between the different possible definitions that the people who are sort of working together might hold. So, in practice, there are going to be some measures which sort of capture the improvements of welfare on different kinds of definitions, especially some of those environmental measures. So, giving animals more opportunities for natural behavior is going to be good for their affective states and their naturalness, and probably their physical health and functioning as well. So, part of it might be just trying to capture where do those areas of overlap lie, what can everyone agree is going to be a good thing for welfare, especially in so many practical contexts where we see, just really quite obvious cases of suffering on any definition. I think people can sort of band together and agree to improve those sorts of things. The other method would be essentially to do something like, I guess a weighted value framework where you've got, these different definitions and you're like, well, look, if this definition were true, we would do this. If this definition were true, we would do this. And sort of, just put different weightings on those and go, okay, can we get sort of a single coherent output of what we should be doing and what we should be measuring based on that, or is it just going to give super divergent results? So in part, it's going to depend on what the differences are. Ideally, we just have everyone trying to come on board on the same page, but yeah, it looks like these are fairly intractable discussions. People have been disagreeing about this for a long time, so trying to find those areas of commonality is probably useful.
Well, it's always difficult to find one definition for a concept like this. So we have one question in the chat by Justine. Thank you a lot for your presentation. I have one question. What about the correctedness of QBA, especially in a context of laboratory?
Okay, good. Yeah. So QBA is a really interesting welfare measure. So for anyone who's listening who's not familiar, it's qualitative behavioral analysis. And it's essentially, taking human observers who are watching animals within a certain environment or a video of that animal and kind of forming something like an intuitive judgment about how that animal is doing along different dimensions relevant to welfare. So they can get sort of different descriptors of that animal, boldness, shyness, fearfulness, confidence, whatever sort of things, whether they're looking happy, depressed, and score them on these sorts of things. And you get an overall judgment of whether that animal seems to be doing well or poorly. Interestingly enough, for something that sounds like it's really, really subjective, it's done really, really well on reliability. QBA shows really good inter-observer reliability. Different people tend to make quite similar judgments. It correlates quite well in many cases with other measures of welfare, sort of physiological measures and those sorts of things, which gives us reason to think that it might be sort of valid, maybe accurate. And it's been applied to a very wide range of species as well. So, it's fairly commonly used in some zoo animals now. You get certainly, a lot of farmed animals and recently even fishes. So one of the worries of QBA is that, perhaps it only works when we have this commonality with the animal that we're viewing, that we understand mammals because we are mammals. But yeah, it seems, at least so far with the work that's been done in fishes, somewhat promising that people are able to apply these kinds of descriptors to decide whether particular fishes, in this case salmon, on videos, whether they look like they're kind of doing well or badly. And again, that seems to come up somewhat accurately. So I guess I'm quite optimistic about the use of QBA done sort of, carefully and within the sort of constraints. So yeah, making sure that you have repeated observers, making sure that you're looking at, what are different people thinking, looking at different judgments over sort of different situations. If you're looking at one animal at different times of day, for instance, under different conditions. But certainly it's a relatively quick and easy measure to apply in that they don't require a lot of complex equipment. And so it can be used in a lot of situations for something like laboratory animals. You need only a few people essentially to either take a video and watch that video of that animal, or even just sort of go past and watch it in person, keeping in mind that that then influences their behavior because they can see and smell you. But yeah, being able to judge that sort of thing, I think, in terms of behavioral measures that tell you something about the overall state of welfare of the animal, I think it's probably one of the most useful ones for those kinds of contexts.
Especially when you have a lot of animal under your care, I guess.
Yeah. And on that note, so you mentioned that it has been used for and with many different species, and I know that there's that worry about how common or how familiar we are with other species and how useful that will be or reliable. Do you think it should be encouraged that it is validated each time is used with a new species? Because and if so, which would you recommend as the gold standard to compare it to as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It should still be validated for new species, in particular ones that are very different for the ones that we're looking at. And so it's hard because, yeah, we don't really have a gold standard for validation against. One of the things about welfare indicators is that they're difficult to validate because we don't just have one thing that we can pick out. And so in this case, looking for validation against clusters of other markers is probably a useful thing to do. So taking, some physiological, some other behavioral measures and looking at whether they correlate. But also, if you can do sort of targeted interventions and validate it then. So looking at, can you take an animal that is, or that you think is in a bad condition, so given some fairly reasonable background assumptions about what is good or bad for that animal as the kind of species it is it a social animal, then it's likely to thrive with social companions and suffer without them, does it have the right kind of foods or shelters? So, sort of some basic assumptions based on its biology. You can then create conditions that are sort of artificially good or bad, or capture conditions that already are. So, go to farms that, have those conditions in place, and then look at whether or not the QBA gives you the kind of answers you would predict under these kinds of interventions. And if it does, then that's, I think, another way of kind of validating it too.
So we have another question from the chat by David. Andrew Crump spoke this morning about precautionary approaches. Should we assume that if some evidence of sentience exists, we should be careful?
I think that depends a lot on what that evidence of sentience is. So, I mean, the precautionary approach, has been most fleshed out in the case of animal sentience by Jonathan Birch, who's recently released a book on it and did this sort of work with Andrew and I on the LSC sentience report. In this view that, to invoke sort of precautionary reasoning and to take that into account is looking for some particular type of high quality, credible evidence. So you're not looking in this case for like an overwhelming balance of evidence, but you want the evidence that you have to be something that's, at least one kind of scientifically respectable indicator that's sitting there. And then, that brings the animal on board as something like a sentience candidate that you can then be investigating more and think about, what are proportional responses that you can put in place to protect that animal. So, sort of I guess people get worried sometimes. They say, if we recognize that insects are sentient, does it mean that I can never walk outside my house again in case I step on insects? It's like, well, that is probably just not a proportionate response. Like you've got to think about feasibility. You've got to think about what's being sacrificed. But yeah, it might mean that you don't go out of your way to step on ants for no reason. And so, yeah, there's all these different ways perhaps of protecting animals that don't incur too much cost. But also just, once animals are put on this kind of, I guess, the sentience candidates list, that's a reason to investigate them more, probably as rapidly as you can. So it's like, well, look, there's a potential risk here, potentially a very large one if the animal's being used, in very large numbers or being impacted by humans. And so that's a reason to think about, what is the magnitude of that risk and what information can we gather to increase our certainty on it.
So I have a question that is a bit related to that. Are there welfare indicators that you find particularly problematic or unreliable, especially when assessing sentience in less studied species?
Yeah, so I guess there's sort of two things there, because there's one about like welfare indicators, which are just, whether an animal's doing well or badly. And then there's sentience indicators, which might be separate sort of things. So you're interested more in the first or the second of those?
Welfare, I guess.
Welfare, yeah. So, I mean, welfare indicators, certainly the one that I always view with probably the most suspicion is cortisol levels. That's because it's like there's just hugely captured, all of welfare science, and everyone wants to measure cortisol. And, I think there's a lot of very good work now that shows that it's just very difficult to actually interpret the results of changes in cortisol for a bunch of different reasons. There are a lot of things that can impact cortisol levels that aren't necessarily negative welfare experiences. And so, while it can be a useful part of the picture of understanding something about an animal, you need other indicators to check whether or not those changes in cortisol actually mean something for the welfare of the animal. And so, yeah, seeing fewer studies where people just measure cortisol would definitely, I think, be an improvement and you do see a lot now where people try and add a behavioral measure or something alongside it and look for whether those two things correlate. So if you can see sort of, them both going in the same direction, that gives you increased confidence that it is measuring what you want it to. But yeah, certainly, validating cortisol measurements for different species is quite difficult because, each species has their own profile. So yeah, using it unreflectively, as is sometimes done, I think is quite a problem for that. And like you said, for understudied species, particularly because you do need to understand, what is the response profile for this species. You need to understand, how does that happen, over the course of the diurnal cycle, over the course of monthly cycles, what kinds of things causes changes in it. If you don't understand that for the specific species that you're looking at, which for understudied species you often won't, then it does seem like a problem. So I think that's true of sort of a lot of these hormonal biomarkers. They can be really, really useful if you know what they're indicating, but it can take a long time for any species to figure out what they're telling you. And perhaps some of the behavioral measures are a bit easier in that regard. So things like QBA, maybe cognitive bias testing as well, which tells us, how optimistic or pessimistic an animal is. They seem to have, I guess, perhaps a more generalized range of applicability. They still need to be validated in different species, but I don't think you just need to have quite as many details about the specific response profiles for those sorts of things.
I think whenever we think something is simple, it's actually not simple at all. And this morning we also talked about the need for multi-approaches, multi-dimension, and I think we are going in the same direction with your answer. So yeah, then I had just a general question, which maybe you get asked at every every presentation. What do you think is the big next step that needs to be taken in animal welfare?
So I guess, in part that depends on by who, in which context. So I mean, in general, when we think about what's going to improve the most lives of the most animals, it's going to be probably changes in policy and regulations around the way animals are protected and used. So, we sort of already hinted at the fact that some very large groups of animals are currently not protected. So, making sure that animals are protected and making sure that legislation is enforced. And particularly when we're talking about numbers of animals impacted, changes in animal agriculture is going to be the sort of the major way that we see, changes made to the way that animals, I guess, are suffering or not. And maybe Janire disagrees with me working on wild animals. Certainly finding out more about when and how wild animals suffer would be part of that as well. But I think, given this current state of information we have about what happens with animal agriculture, and knowing where suffering occurs and where it could be prevented, I think changes in legislation preventing some of the worst harms there are probably some of the quick and easy wins for getting quite a large amount. But, talking more on the scientific point of view, I think this work in just developing measures of animal welfare and validating them, animal welfare science is still a very young science, and we're still seeing, I guess, an explosion of a bunch of different possible measures of varying quality. And right now we're still in the process of trying to figure out which of those are going to stick, which ones are actually going to be in the long term, the best ways of measuring welfare, which combinations of them are going to get us on the best path. And so there's a huge amount of variation that can make it very difficult to compare different studies, to compare different recommendations, all of that. But, it's sort of a necessary part of where we stand right now, because until you explore this large range of options, you can't start to compare and prune them down. So I think, just investing more time and resources into this sort of, developing and validating indicators will have huge payoffs down the line when we're able to better assess the welfare of different animals.
If I can add something to that, follow-up question. So I guess that's kind of like the big step in terms of the science. What do you think is the big step in terms of the community of animal welfare science, like the field? So that's on those definitions, and if we should either look for like a standard definition of welfare, but the field is progressing so fast lately. We have tons of new technologies that we could use, so we could collaborate with different fields, and we can make use of like the huge databases that we have. What do you think would be the best next big roads in terms of the researchers, the community, kind of like the people aspect?
Yeah, that's interesting. So certainly, you sort of gestured out this idea of, getting clearer on animal welfare definitions. It's probably a useful thing, even if it's just people being explicit about what definition they're using in their research, and why that links to the kinds of indicators that they're using. Because I guess, but one thing I see in some sort of animal welfare science is people saying something like, animal welfare means how an animal feels, therefore we measure their body condition or something. And you're like, okay, but like, what are the steps between these things here that you're actually looking at? So I think, yeah, just being very clear up front for everyone. But in terms of, I think, the general ways forwards for the field, I think, you're saying there's like lots of people now doing lots of work. So in part, the kind of the interpretation, the bringing together of lots of these things, like the cohesion of it is going to be what's really important. And so you see some people doing these large kind of, I'm trying to think like really large databases where they're trying to bring together like ranges of information and lots of things, sort of like the mini zoos project. I think it's like mini birds and things like that, where people, different researchers who are doing like these little projects everywhere are able to put these onto sort of centralized databases and, improve the sort of analytic power of what they're researching there to get like larger trends. And I think that sort of thing is going to be really, really useful going forward. So you get fewer of these sort of silos of different research and more of this ability to collaborate. I suspect AI technology and other kinds of technology are going to be super useful in those kinds of ways as well. As much as there's a lot of dangers in using different kinds of AI, I think used carefully, it can be used really well to kind of, do the sorts of things I'm talking about, create databases, analyze patterns within them, and also just the use of AI and other technologies in actually collecting data on animal welfare. So not just analyzing the existing data, but, people are using all kinds of AI algorithms now to try and do behavior analysis, for instance, which can potentially, save researchers hundreds of hours of video coding. And that sort of thing may allow then, research to move forwards much more quickly in certain kinds of areas, which allows us to get more information about what's happening with a range of animals.
Yeah, we already had a bit related to that one workshop on a system that detects insects. So it identifies which insects land on a platform. So I'm sure at some point someone will develop animal welfare IA that detects in which state the animals are. So we have two questions in the chat. The first one by Justine is, do you think we still need to develop more positive indicators in laboratory animal, for example?
Yeah, so this gets at something really important actually, which is, that a lot of research in animal welfare has so far focused on suffering and the prevention of suffering, which, is vastly important because if you're suffering, obviously your life is going to go really badly, but that has sort of correlated with a general sort of oversight where people have not been thinking too much about the positive experiences of animals. And certainly, if we think about welfare from the point of view of subjective experiences and affects, thinking about, removing all your sources of suffering, that's not a good life necessarily. You're not thriving, you're not experiencing all these potentially positive things. And so, yeah, certainly I think developing both, I guess, thinking about indicators of positive welfare for animals in contexts like laboratories, but also thinking about what are the conditions in their lives that need to be provided for to provide them with positive welfare. And so there's a large project at the moment happening sort of across the European Union. It's a cost action that's called LIFT, which is about, thinking about positive animal welfare. And it's a very, very large group, hundreds of researchers who are trying to address different questions on positive animal welfare, including how do we define it and how do we measure it. And so, I think certainly there is this increasing focus. I think there is a recognition already that we do need indicators of positive welfare. A lot of the behavioral indicators, I think we've got good behavioral indicators of positive welfare. I think much less good physiological indicators. There are a lot of physiological indicators related to suffering. They're much more difficult to apply to the positive case. So development of those kind of indicators, but also application of them. So I think, that there are probably enough that someone who in a laboratory wanted to tell if their animal had positive welfare experiences would have ways of trying to understand that. It's just a matter of getting at them and applying them. But thinking hard about, what are the real things that cause an animal to have a positive experience of the world. So once, the absence of it sort of, we think of these 5 freedoms, the absence of hunger and thirst and pain and distress and all that. Once you've got all those, what do you need to add to put it into the positive? And some of those things are going to be perceptual experiences, it's going to be the pleasures of eating, the pleasures of hearing things that you like to hear, being comfortable and warm, being around your friends. But one of the things I think that's an increasing area of focus within animal welfare science is the importance of agency and choice and control for animals. And so I think that's something else I think is going to be a big path way forwards for the way that we think about animals, particularly the way we manage animals in captivity, is that giving them opportunities to exercise agency, to be in control, to make choices about where they live, even if it's just having two substrates in their cage and they can choose to move between them. Because, a lot of preference tests may show animals have a favorite, but they also show that they only use that favorite 60% of the time, and 40% they would still like to have the other. So yeah, just putting two substrates, putting two different dens they can go towards, having a few different types of food, giving them control over anything that you can, I think is going to be a way forwards to improve our welfare as well.
I guess some researchers are scared of adding bias to their experiment by doing that, but also when you improve the quality of life and the animal welfare of your animals, you also improve the quality of the data, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, pretending the animals don't have individual differences isn't going to be any better. So, you go, okay, well, now you've put two substrates in each of your mouse cages, and some of the mice are always on sawdust and some of them are always on the wood chip or whatever. And you're like, okay, but now we have a problem because, the ones that are on the wood chip more might have a different response. It's like, but they were the ones who probably were more miserable when they only had sawdust. And so you probably got different kind of bias in your results because they were more stressed by their environment than the other ones were. So I think these individual differences exist anyway. But it is difficult, and trying to standardize experiments, I don't downplay how tricky that is. But I think ignoring the fact that the welfare experience and the level of stress and how frustrated an animal feels, ignoring how much that impacts on research as well, is also not going to help.
Yeah, I would say it might actually help interpret the data and why those outliers are actually why we have so much noise that we can't understand. So it's probably going to improve that interpretation and that quality rather than the opposite. It might increase the cost, but it will also decrease the cost in terms of veterinary costs, for example, if they are miserable all the time, or if they have to repeat the experiment 3 times because they keep getting different results.
Yeah, I actually have an anecdote about that. I have a friend who is working in mice, and she was doing social recognition task, and a few of the cages were not doing the cat task correctly. She was not understanding why, and actually they were stressed and they were just eating the whiskers. I don't remember. There is a name for that. I don't remember the name now. But because of that, they were not able to have this tactile stimulation between each other when they were interacting. So I'm told by the committee that actually we were talking about the Mani group and this type of research. And actually in the next session, we have a talk from this group. So if that's interesting for you, you should check it out. So we have another question by Abby, which is actually 2 questions. What about variation in how animal welfare is approached globally? Are there differences in how policies are implemented in the global north as compared as the global south?
All right, so I don't think I'm a good person to speak on this. I'm not deeply familiar with the differences as a group, but certainly there are differences globally. And this isn't just global north, global south. I mean, the US is global north and really not very good in the way it sets legislation, but B, the way it implements it as well. So there are huge differences between different regions. And I mean, certainly you do see patterns where very often countries that sort of have lower socioeconomic status don't have the resources to invest in animals. Certainly, this starts being seen as a luxury, I guess, that, if your people aren't receiving all their needs yet, you don't look at animals. I think certainly there's a growing recognition in this sort of One Health and One Welfare initiatives that these don't necessarily have to be put up against each other. And so, you see different countries, and again, it's very hard to make generalizations based on what they are, just different countries doing these kinds of initiatives. So some countries have got really excellent recognition of animal sentience and protections of all kinds of animals. Some countries are still lagging on this. Typically, it relates to differences in cultural opinions. So you've got lots of different surveys now that people are doing about different countries and the citizens of those countries and how they view animal welfare questions and how they view the sentience of animals. And there are large differences between groups, large differences between countries that make these things more difficult. And so I guess, part of what the animal welfare advocacy community tries to do is to reach out and connect with grassroots movements within those countries, in a sort of, I guess, non-imperialistic kind of way to try and yeah, you know, assist work that's already being done to try and help people get where they want to be, and to, you know, provide resources for the kinds of advocacy they want to get policy changes.
Yeah, we had actually yesterday we had a plenary by Gladys Kalema's Zikosuka. She was talking about Goria in Uganda, and how using community she was able to improve the welfare of humans, but also gorillas, because there was a lot of disease that were transmitted through water and things like that. So we have time for one or two questions.
I might just do a follow-up on that. So I think those differences between the regions, they don't only come in terms of the policies and the legislation, but also, or even like the technology advancement that they have, but also how they view welfare and animals as a whole, like the relationship they have with the animals and the knowledge that some of the communities share about those those populations of animals. So it might be the case that in some countries we still struggle to consider some animals sentience, while in others they have considered them all along. There was never a question. It might be in question how to actually protect them, or how to implement it into the policies that they have. But the sentience was never in question, and the way that is approached is going to be just different. There's that relationship with the animals in the culture, in even like different religions across the countries. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I guess this societal aspect or cultural aspect can have a lot of weight on this decision, and sometimes you need a lot of time to implement changes, and you need people that are acting as leader and pushing this type of changes. So I have one last question, which can be like two questions actually. So you were working as a zookeeper and animal welfare officer in zoos. So I'm interested in what pushed you to become a researcher in animal welfare. And my second question is also, how do you convince zookeepers, and if you, during your experience, you also had difficulty to convince policymakers to invest for better welfare in captive care?
Yeah. So on the first bit, yeah, I think just being a zookeeper. So, you know, I was a zookeeper for quite a long time, almost 20 years by the time I sort of moved on to full-time research. So I was doing it part-time still while I was doing my PhD. Yeah, I just was becoming increasingly interested in how we answer questions about what's good or bad for animals. Like, certainly in zoos, you can see a lot of received wisdom, a lot of information that's passed between people. And sometimes I would just sort of wonder, you know, like, what justifies this, and how do we know? How do we know, you know, that these things are actually true about the animals? And so that got me interested in sort of, you know, the philosophy and the science of how we measure welfare and how we can figure out what's good or bad for animals. And over time, yeah, just got sort of increasingly interested in focusing on that. Even though I sort of loved being with the animals in front of me, these bigger questions seem like sort of important to work on. But on the second bit, definitely this, definitely it can be difficult to get people on board with this. And I mean, in terms of what I was working at, sort of, I guess, not policymakers in a broader sense, but just, you know, the sort of the managers, or the, you know, whoever it was in the institutes that were in charge of giving resources to these sorts of things, it could be very, very difficult to do. And so, you know, one thing is, it can be difficult to convince keepers that, you know, high welfare is important, at least high welfare over and above good health and nutrition. So, you know, I think any zookeeper, they want to make sure their animals well fed, and that, you know, they have a clean environment and they're free of disease. But these kind of extra things we do, you know, the enrichment, making sure that they have interesting lives, that they have cognitive challenges, that is very often seen as just a little bonus that you do if you have time at the end of the day. That's the first thing to go as soon as, you know, you get busy. And that is something that I tried to fight against. That, you know, it's difficult to do. You sort of do what you can. And certainly getting structures in place, one of the things that really helped was having things like enrichment schedules, so that people, you know, every day it's like, well, look, it's Monday, and you have, it's, you know, this Tuesdays are scent enrichment days, and this is foraging enrichment day or something. So not only did they know that they had to provide some enrichment, but they knew what kind, and that sort of forced variety, so you don't get those keepers who just kind of throw a cardboard box in every day and call it enrichment. So I think, yeah, like formalizing it as part of the workload is part of it, but that requires input from management as well to make sure that there are sort of time and resources available to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I guess if some zoos would have some guidelines or planning, if it would make them more motivated to implement these changes.
And some zoos do really, really well on it. Some of the bigger zoos now have quite a lot invested in doing that. And I think it's probably the smaller zoos that are more challenged by it because they are just have fewer resources and fewer staff.
So we have one last question from the chat, and then I think we will wrap up after that. David is asking, what can you give one change in human behavior that would be the one thing that would do the most for animal welfare?
Going vegan. Yeah, I mean, it's probably hard because it's like throwing value thing. But yeah, I think right now that at least shifting away from buying, intensively farmed products would probably just be, yeah, one of the biggest ways of making a big difference to the ways that sort of animal welfare is realized in the world.
And it's also good for climate change.
That's right, so extra benefits.
Okay, so I think we are going to end this session. Thank you for joining us on this workshop. Thank you, Heather, for your presentation and your interesting discussion and comments. Thank you, Janire, for presenting the Wild Animal Initiative. If you are interested, don't hesitate to check their website. If you have more questions for either or Janire, you can ask them in the Discord channel for the workshop. And yeah, I will see you soon. The next session is a Meet the PI session, by the way. Bye.
Thank you.